When a federal agency fails to follow the strict legal procedures, federal courts abruptly strike down their mandates. Rulemaking is the formal decision-making process federal agencies use to establish requirements that legally bind the public. Agencies must prove they acted rationally and followed all procedures. Failing to do either allows the courts to invalidate the rule as arbitrary and capricious. Coast Guard rulemaking teams are bound by these same strict judicial standards. To shield their rules from judicial review, these teams create an administrative record, a comprehensive body of documentation proving that all relevant considerations were weighed before adoption. The exact parameters for building this record are dictated by the Administrative Procedure Act, or APA. A valid regulation serves as the final output of a highly scrutinized, legally defensive architecture. Before a rule is drafted, it must be explicitly authorized by a congressional statute. Congress usually confers this authority to the president or a department secretary, who then hands that power down through a specific delegation of authority to the commandant. The commandant receives and manages this statutory authority, acting as the centralized hub for the Coast Guard's regulatory power. Even then, the commandant often redelegates authority downward to the signatory. Every link in this chain must be documented in writing. Mandatory copies of these documents are captured by the Office of General Law and the Office of Regulations and Administrative Law. Without an unbroken, written chain of delegation reaching from Congress to the final signatory, the resulting rule is legally void. The standard engine for most Coast Guard regulation is informal rulemaking, governed by 5 U.S. Code Section 553. The term informal is misleading. The actual process is rigid and deeply prescriptive. It is called informal simply to contrast it with formal rulemaking, which involves courtroom-style evidentiary hearings and recorded testimony. Formal rulemaking is exceptionally rare. If an officer believes one is necessary to prepare a headquarters regulation, they must contact Commandant CGLRA immediately. Informal means there is no trial, but it still demands a strict gauntlet of public and procedural scrutiny. This timeline illustrates the standard informal pipeline. It relies on 2 mandatory procedural hurdles. First, the agency must publish a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, containing the proposed rule's text. The NPRM triggers a mandatory public comment period. Internal Coast Guard policy generally allows the public at least 90 days to respond. This 90-day policy also applies to interim rules. The second major hurdle occurs after the agency publishes the final rule. The rule cannot legally take effect until a mandatory buffer zone of at least 30 days has passed. This timeline guarantees the public has a voice and time to adapt before any Coast Guard requirement becomes enforceable law. Sometimes an agency must act immediately, bypassing the standard timeline. This requires finding good cause, a legal standard demanding precise justification. The situation must meet one of 3 conditions: impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Impractical means satisfying the procedural requirements would unavoidably prevent the agency from fulfilling its statutory duty. Unnecessary applies when a mandate leaves the agency with 0 discretion over the wording. Seeking comment serves no purpose if the text cannot be changed. The public interest exception is reserved for emergency health, safety, or rapid disaster response scenarios. Administrative convenience is never a valid basis. Shunting off public participation to issue health and safety rules requires a dramatic, verifiable change in circumstances. Whatever the basis for the exception, the Coast Guard must explicitly articulate its detailed good cause justification in the preamble of the published rule. The good cause exception acts as an emergency valve. It requires exhaustive legal justification to survive judicial review. Notice how this entire APA timeline and bypass lane sit inside a larger framework. This bounding box represents the Coast Guard's Regulatory Development Program, or RDP. The RDP manages the life cycle of a rule, beginning when an office chief identifies a need and driving it all the way to the publication of the enforceable regulation. Its ultimate goal is to address safety, security, and environmental concerns by establishing economically efficient rules. To maintain quality control, the RDP relies on the Mission Management System, or MMS. Look at the active data signals feeding back into the process. The MMS continuously uses performance data, stakeholder needs, and policy feedback to refine and improve operations. The Office of Regulatory and Administrative Law, and the Office of Standards Evaluation and Development use this feedback to determine the exact processes each rulemaking team will execute. A valid regulation requires statutory authority, an unbroken chain of delegation, and strict adherence to the APA. Whether the agency navigates the 90-day informal track or exhaustively justifies a good cause exception, the objective is to build an unassailable administrative record. Only when this procedural architecture is strictly followed does a rule transform into a lasting, enforceable regulation within the Code of Federal Regulations.